Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, welcome to another Midrash Rabba 2.0 with Rabbi Q and After His Heart Ministries. So, was the Messiah trained by Joseph? That is the question we are going to address today. For those of you who do not know what a Midrash is, it is a connection between two wise men and is a discussion about the interpretation of Bible verses, specifically of Torah. And so, generally speaking, a midrash is not only speculation, but also folklore. And it can also contain some historical elements that aren't necessarily in the verses of the 66 book compendium of the Bible. The Protestant canon is not the only canon out there. And when we start to accept that other people may not be wrong, but maybe are right as well, our thinking changes significantly, doesn't it? Because there were 70 nations in existence at the time of the Tower of Babel. There were 70 different languages developed from that confounding of the languages or the confusing of the languages that occurred at the Tower of Babel. And therefore, there are 70 different possibilities of interpretation of wisdom of Torah, meaning that each nation took away a nugget from their understanding of the wisdom of that time. I'm not going to get too deep into that because of obviously, that parasha has come and gone, a parasha being a section that was divided up by Ezra, and a parasha being basically a weekly reading. Ezra had kind of a schedule that he put in place so that basically the people of Israel would hear the Torah in the marketplace throughout the week. And so there was like daily sections, but then the weekly section itself contained a whole entire portion of the Torah. And then on Shabbat, he would teach on the wisdom behind those verses. Okay, so we kind of follow the same format where we operate a little bit more in the ancient Hebrew, but generally speaking, that's kind of what we got going on. So generally speaking, what we do is we basically go through and Deborah is actually going to be off camera today, but she is going to go through and give us the first question, do the rabbis nugget last? And we're going to spend about maybe 40 minutes per question and kind of work through that unless there's more questions now. It's just let me know if there's more questions.
Give me a moment.
Okay.
What does it mean that the cows, quote unquote, stood by the cows of the Nile?
Okay. So that is actually going to take us into our first discussion here in terms of basically I'll have you know, I asked a number of these questions, and I don't know if there's more questions from other people, but I asked these questions because this is one of those parashas where you really got to kind of sink your teeth into what's between the lines and really, really pull back from just this typical Bible story Sunday morning understanding that most people have of this story. Joseph went to prison. He got out of prison. He became the ruler over Egypt. His brothers showed up, needed help. He gave them help and then revealed himself to them, and that's it. There's a lot more present in this process that we need to be getting into. So having said that, we definitely need to jump into this because we've got only these 40-minute increments for these questions. So let's start by just taking a look at the verse that specifically that I'm talking about, and we'll jump into it. So one of the first things I want to do is say that a lot of times Torah, okay, so let me make that clear. Let me make that clear first of all. In general, Torah is actually going to be mouth to mouth spoken to Moses. So Yahweh speaks to Moses and Moses repeats back and then writes. Okay. We know that no other person in the existence of humanity had this privilege, because he makes it clear that his prophets he talks to differently. Okay. So from that perspective, then, as we look into this, it's important for you to understand that when Torah, as a person who, Yeshua, leaves something out or adds something in, and you don't really necessarily get the full picture from a single verse, it is important to pay attention to parallels and repeated things and things that seem to be missing from a verse, etc. So what I'm going to do, I'm shifting into the Young's literal translation, because I consider that to be probably the most accurate word for word, grammar for grammar translation of the Bible that still maintains an English nuance. And so we're jumping into this. And so this is what it says. And it cometh to pass at the end of 2 years of days that Paro is dreaming, and lo, he is standing by the river. And lo, from the river cometh up our seven kine of fair appearance and fat in flesh, and they feed among the reeds. Okay. And lo, seven other kine are coming up after them out of the river, of bad appearance and lean flesh, and they stand near the kine on the edge of the river. Okay. And the kine of bad appearance and lean in flesh eat up the seven kine of fair appearance and fat, and Pharaoh awaketh. Okay. So what most people miss, I want you to pay attention to this now. It says, from the river coming up are seven kine. Let's just go ahead and shift this into the New Living Translation, which I don't necessarily trust, but I can tell you that it's better than most of them because it definitely interprets the idioms more often. So what we're looking at, and this is important, it says, in his dream he saw seven fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Okay, so they are not near the edge of the river. Then he saw seven more cows come up from behind them, or come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Okay, this actually is not good. Let's get into, say, maybe the NASB. The NLT went too far, and I'll show you why. What it says here, then behold, seven other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and thin, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. Then the ugly and thin cows ate the seven fine-looking fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. So what do people miss here? Let me explain this. People miss something very important about this beginning of this Torah portion, and that is that the cows that went and ate to begin with did not stand on the edge of the Nile. It would have said that in Torah. But there were other cows standing on the edge of the Nile. And when the seven lean ones came out, they went and stood with them. Okay. And then after that, they consumed the ones that were eating in the marsh. Careful that you don't miss this, that there were three locations: the Nile itself, the edge of the Nile, and the marsh, and they were different. Okay. The marsh is not the edge of the Nile. In fact, depending on how far back the marsh is from the Nile, it actually could be freshwater, which means true grass and things growing there that would not be destroyed by the brine from the salt water. Because I'm sorry, not the brine from the salt water, but from the bad toxicness of the river. Okay. The best way I could explain it to you is when the Nile gets hit by Moses and the blood they dig around the Nile for fresh water. Okay, so they already knew how to get fresh water out of this Nile that was evidently, I don't think it was briny, because that would indicate that it was that the Mediterranean was feeding the Nile. That's not true. Lake Victoria feeds the Nile, but for whatever reason, it was extremely mineral rich and was not conducive to things growing with it. Only in the marshes besides the Nile could things actually grow and become green and be okay. And what's interesting about that is that means that all of the irrigation systems and all the other stuff that fed the crops and all that did not receive the blood, because it says the Egyptians dug around the Nile trying to find fresh water. They knew that they could find fresh water by digging around the Nile. What's that mean? That means that they knew that the Nile was not good for irrigation and all that kind of stuff. And you can actually look into that a little bit. I don't have all the information, but I know it has to do with volcanism. It has to do with what is happening with Lake Victoria and all the nastiness of the East African Rift Valley, the amount of sulfur that's poured into that river, and a number of other things. Okay, so learn that in geology class. I don't know, when I was like 25, so 25 years ago. Okay, so the premise is basically, this is important because there are 4 levels of Hebrew teaching. And in general, we would say, okay, we've got this literal thing where they stand next to these cows, some cows, we don't know what cows, on the edge of the Nile. Then we have the cows that are in the marsh. And then later on, these other ones come along and eat them. Now, what it says in the NLT, unfortunately, is, oh, they came along and stood by the cows that were in the marsh. Nope, doesn't say that. It says on the edge of the Nile, right? Okay, so there's a few things that we need to get into in this context. Number one, the cows on the edge of the Nile represent something. The cows who came out of the Nile and began to eat in the marsh represent something. And the cows that came out of the Nile and stood by the cows that were on the edge of the Nile represent something. You say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't necessarily mean anything important. Well, I want you to remember what this represents. All of this represents an economic system, or at least its process, right? So what do we have? We have the lean cows that represent the years, right, of famine that were coming. And we have the fat cows that represent the years of abundance that were coming, okay? And then what we have is a third group of cows that represent something, but we don't know what yet. So that's why I asked this question. I'm curious if this has triggered anything. I am definitely open to hearing from the people, obviously, who are on Zoom with me, to see if anybody has any insight or input. Any? Okay. Anybody out there in internet land want to bring it up, or unmute and tell me if there's anything that they have? Okay.
You know, when I was reading
this,
one thing that brought my attention to this was, and I don't know if this was the first time it ever happened, but it was the explanation of the 7-year cycle. And so to me, when I was reading this, it just kept showing me time and seasons and cycles and bringing about balance to not only the land, but to the people themselves.
Sure. Yeah, we could definitely get into that thought process, Paula K, for sure, because truth be told, if we're having a lean set of 7 years and an abundant set of 7 years, we're talking about expansion and contraction here, right? We're talking about a contractive set versus an expansive set. So then we can necessarily get into the Shemitah, and we can get into the Jubilees, because we know that the cycles themselves, these revolutions that go, they come up in sets. And what I mean by that is that we have day one. Let's just start with the 7 days of the week, technically, because anybody who has experience in even just a little bit of Genesis in the image of God know that those are actually not days. But let's just say that we go with it for a minute and talk about the cycle of the week. We know that the week came from Babylon, but very specifically to the Hebrew exiles who were in Babylon. And we know that Babylon itself didn't have a week governance until those Hebrews were in exile in Babylon. And the way that they calculated the week was because they had ancestors who had taught them that on the seventh day, which is our Saturday, the manna didn't fall. You need to remember that this whole thing is connected in with manna. And so the context is we have day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where we don't have a change. But then in day 6, there's an abundance. So could we conclude that week 6, there's an abundance? Could we conclude then that the 7th or the 6th 7-year period of a Jubilee includes abundance? Possibly, maybe. But here's the interesting thing about it. What we do know is that in a cyclical state of expansion, contraction, and correction, because really everything needs to balance out. When the intensification of all power in the universe created the first vessel of reception, the first thing that he could pour all of his benevolence into through a desire to bestow, he created a vessel to receive an expansive energy. But then that the cognition about giving that expansive energy for free to those who would end up in violation of Torah was not okay with his conscience. And so a balance was created of contraction to balance them out. Unfortunately, two pull against each other. So what ends up happening is eventually there's a balance between the expansive male or masculine principle, the contractive female principle, creating a not necessarily a gender fluid, but a gender neutral center balance between the masculine principle and the feminine principle. And that specific one is the easiest way to access the mind of God, right? But also is contained in it is the path through the Messiah to get there, which not only authenticates a necessity for not a substitutionary sacrifice, but a mediator, as it were. One of the arguments of the anti-missionary rabbis is that they didn't need a mediator after Moses, right? That Moses set the stage for mediation, and then after that, there was no more mediation. Torah was written. Most evangelical dispensationalists who lean to the side of Reform or lean to the side of Calvinism have a tendency to believe that there no longer needs to be signs or miracles because the Bible's been written and been compiled, right? So both Jewish rabbis and Christian theologians are in error of understanding that there's a necessity to pass through a mediation. That mediation is the push-pull. So we can easily conclude that a abundance will be followed by a contraction, which will be followed by a balance between the two. Whatever was lost will be replaced. Whatever is overgained will be taken away. And then we repeat the cycle again. Expansion, contraction, correction. Expansion, contraction, correction, right? So it's very possible that in our Jubilee process, that the 6th week of the Jubilee, or the 6th 7-year period of the Jubilee, and the 7th 7-year period of the Jubilee are these specific ones. I think that's really amazing what you brought up, PK. But I want to get a little bit deeper into this context, because really what we have here is that these cows that come out are ultimately going to be the contraction, and they're ultimately going to be the result, right, of an overabundance. But what's interesting is they don't go and stand beside or in agreement with the cows that are in the marsh, but they go and stand beside in agreement with the cows that are standing on the edge of the Nile. Now, the intrigue from this comes from the point of view of basically influence, but also like kind attracting like kind. There are a number of significant things that we need to get into, but remember, these are Egyptians. These are not Hebrews. They are not in covenant with Yahweh. In fact, every time Yahweh wants to bless the socks off of his people, he uses Egypt and takes their abundance away from them. So whatever Egypt is off in, they're off significant enough that every time that Yahweh wants to do something for his people, like with Abraham, like with the Israelites leaving, and I'm getting ahead of myself by jumping into Shemot or Exodus and saying, look, these people left with these riches. Look, Abraham left with these riches. But what I want you to understand is that Mitzrayim is a Hebrew word, and not the real name of Egypt. In fact, Egypt itself is not a real name for that location. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this is important. Number one is that every people that left the Tower of Babel and were scattered had a different name for that location. But the Hebrews called it Matzor, right? Mitzrayim. And what's significant about that is Matzar means to bind. But what's more significant is that Matzar in a plural is Mitzrim, which is what? More than one binding, right? But it's actually more than two bindings. Why? Because Mitzrayim is the dual plural, which means there's not more than two, which means there's two bindings or two limitations. The word can also mean limitation or boundary. It can actually be used as a land boundary in the sense of like a survey, stretching a rope across the land and placing survey markers, or what we call boundary stones. And so I think there's something very significant to be said about the fact that the place or location by which all of this occurring is not in Hebrew hands. So I think two very important points that need to be said. Number one is that when Abraham experienced a famine in the land, he went down to Egypt. And then when he experienced a famine again that was different from that one, Egypt must have been in a state in which he could not go down there anymore. Now, deep Kabbalistic mystical texts say that Abraham actually protected Sarah's connection to the serpent by bringing her out of Egypt and not staying there. Now, I'm going to tell you, a mistake that you can get caught up in that is dangerous is believing that there was a snake in the garden, okay? Believing that there was actually a physical, cobra or asp or python, okay? That's a mistake that is common to the Christian faith. It's a mistake that is less common to the Jewish faith, because let me tell you something. The Jews are not obsessed with demons and Satan. The Christians are. And the Christians are because it's a construct of a control mechanism that the Pope back in a certain era used to cause the people to believe that they did not have the same status or class as priests and the Pope. I'm not going to get into that, and I'm not going to mess with that today. You've heard my soapbox about that. You've heard my sermons about that. I think what's more important here is that we get our minds wrapped around the concept that like kind attracts like kind. The cows that were standing on the edge of the Nile did not attract the abundance, but the contraction. So, what do we know? We know that from ancient times, we can deduce through information that the Hasidim or the magicians have been a part of the operation of the Egyptians. In fact, Abraham's encounter with Pharaoh does contain information about how to make the plagues that were happening in Egypt go away. Yes, there were plagues happening when Pharaoh took Abraham's wife into his chamber. When he took him into his chamber, number one, and this is important, Pharaoh was not confronted by God directly like Abimelech, which says a lot about Abimelech. God spoke to Abimelech in a dream, which makes him a prophet, but we won't get into that. And furthermore, Abimelech doesn't do to Abraham and Isaac what Pharaoh later does to his descendants. However, later on, the Philistines do start to cause problems, but there's this huge covenant made with Abimelech that was not made with Pharaoh. But here's something amazing, okay? The Hasidim, or the magicians, the magi that were in operation in Egypt, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever, even especially if we look at I think it was Pythagoras who went and studied in the Egyptian schools and kind of referenced that they were from those Egyptian schools were from ancient times, and they were mystical schools. But what we can deduce from both the information in this parasha, the information about Abraham, and later information with Moses, is that the Hasidim were actually the mystics in Egypt, not the Egyptians. The Egyptians were agricultural. They were superior in agriculture and in architecture. Okay. And there was a lot of numbers who came through that system of agriculture and architecture. In other words, they had open borders. They allowed people into the Egyptian culture regardless of race. Okay. However, they were actually racial. We'll get into that later. But the premise is, and this is important, is that we can logically conclude from the fact that these cows go and stand next to these cows on the Nile that the good cows, the fat and sleek cows who are eating from the marsh, who are being wise not to consume the poisonous water, etc., were not that's not what attracted those lean cows. Meaning what? Something causes the correction. And I propose to you that the correction is actually the part that is the warning. But you need to remember, Egypt is agriculturally superior and therefore supplies Canaan with food when the famines come. Why did the famines keep coming to Canaan? Well, I propose to you that what it says in Torah over time is don't be like these people. Don't marry them. Don't be like them. Go kill them and wipe them out. Why? Because they exploit and they slaughter and they consume humans. factor in the sodomy, which consequently has to do with a number of things, but can be definitely within the wisdom of a birth rate supporting a nation. You stop having people reproduce because of their preference, and there is a reduction in the ability to keep that civilization alive. Now, I don't need to get into the historical, anthropological, and psychological information that I just gave you. You can go research that. But the system itself seems to indicate that Canaan keeps going into these famines because of its darkness, or its choices not to at least go with the Noahic covenant, right? Now, I know in times past I've been very careful to say, the Torah is for the world. The Torah is for everyone. But the Noahic covenant offered advice on how to be in what? Natural flow with natural order processes. It was never supposed to be a canceller of the Mosaic covenant, as Gentile Christians seem to think, but instead was in addition to learning Torah, practice these things, because these things actually lead to something bad. Over and over and over again in Torah, it says, do not worship me the way the nations worship their gods. Do not practice these things. Don't learn their culture. Don't learn their customs. Sounds racial. Sounds absolutely separatist. But there's more to meets the eye, because why? They were practicing cannibalism, exploitation, slaughtering of humans. Okay, so now what we need to do then is say, can we logically deduce that this contraction was coming? However, because Egypt is the supplier during the famines, if a famine came to Egypt, the world would end. Everybody would just die. And so the answer to that question is not in this week's parasha. And truth be told is I'm not going to actually answer it per se. But what I am going to say is that like kind attracts like kind, and these sleek cows came up out of the Nile and stood by the cows that were on the side of the Nile, meaning they were drawn into the ones that were on the side of the Nile or the edge of the Nile, were not wholesome and were not wise. Why? The cows that went and ate from the marsh knew not to eat from the plants that were growing on the side of the Nile, but instead from the marsh, right? There's a number of things that we can look into with this, but short version is it gives you a little bit to think about, that sometimes the consequences that should come to a people who practice horrible things don't come because the preservation of them results in something else. Remember, the wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous. Well, guess what? That means the wicked have to prosper for a little bit while they build up wealth. Scary, isn't it? Okay. So that pretty much addresses that thought process. But I think I want to kind of get a little bit into the concept of intention and influence. Because when Abraham is in Egypt and the plagues start to come, it's actually the Kasdim, or it's the magicians, who determine that it's Abraham who's the problem. How'd they know that, right? Well, number one, and I think this is important, is we know that Abraham came from Ur, right? Which was what? Ur of the Chaldeans, which is what? City of the magicians. And so we know that Abraham was probably known, right? Okay. The reason I bring this up is because that was a famine too, right? And the way I understand it is part of Joseph's interpretation brings to the table a statement that a famine such as was, so shall never be again, will be upon the land. So how much of this is influence and how much of this is intention? I would say that there's a part here where we can conclude that these lean cows that come up out of the water, that are attracted by the cows that are on the edge of the Nile, is that the past. And I'm going to prove it to you here in a minute. But I want to propose that the past, right, is influencing Egypt. And I'm going to propose that the 7 lean cows are actually guilt, and that the 7 abundant cows are actually a release from guilt. And the reason why the 7 lean cows consume the 7 abundant cows is because that's what guilt does. It compounds. Okay. The reason I bring this up is because we need to remember that Paul said the Torah was not written for them. Again, Joseph is just living his life. Pharaoh is just living his life. Pharaoh never knew he was going to end up in Torah. And we don't know which Pharaoh it was, because there's a bunch of timeline switching that's occurred, which I'm sure that we could speculate is not an accident, but let's just go with the idea that maybe somebody made a mistake and that's why they can't find these pharaohs. But truth be told is, however it works out, we know that the answer to a lot of our questions is actually coming in the next parasha, but we know that Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of everything. And we'll get to that in a minute. But I think it is important that you realize that there is plenty of reference to the word Mitzrayim, meaning 2 bindings or 2 limitations, 2 things preventing the people of Canaan. And really, technically, let's just jump into this. Jacob, not Israel, right? Because when we get into this section of this parasha that's discussing him, who is he called, right? But the premise, and this is important, is that Jacob, not Israel, is in a state of famine. And according to Torah, Deuteronomy 28, famine is a curse as a result of a violation of covenant. Remember, Jacob is the non-covenant name. Israel is the covenant name. And I will tell you, if you have the privilege of receiving a new name from the intensification of all power in the universe, the old name will most likely stay buried within the limitations of your life. And the new name will reflect and will always be a part of the operation of the new you. So when the old name is used or the old name is referenced, most likely it is a part of your life that still needs tikkun. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into that, but I'm just going to propose to you that that's what's going on with Jacob. That the non-covenant part of Jacob is in operation here because he has to send his sons to Egypt, of all places, to get what? Food. What's food? Torah, right? So he has to send his sons to Egypt to get Torah because it's not present within him. Why? Because he's not operating in covenant. He's not operating in covenant because of what? The circumstances, what? He lost Rachel, who was his, for lack of better words, Acharei Tzelim. It was other gods, right? We look at Benjamin, who she names one thing and he names another, and we also look at what happened with Joseph, right? The value of Rachel stays stuck with Jacob, but he doesn't realize she's the one that brought the false gods into his life. She's the one who demands from him and does not do what it says to do in Torah and in when Rabbi Shaul and Cephas or Peter indicate that when a wife needs to win a husband back to the covenant, she has to get under him, right? We call it submission, but that's a horrible word. That's a horrible word, because I can tell you the wife's voice is superior to the man. How do we know? Because Adam ate of the fruit, and it says, because you listen to the voice of your wife, cursed is the ground for your sake, right? Okay. So now what we have is this guilt, right? How do we know that it's guilt? Because what guilt does is it consumes your abundance as a result of a belief that you are not worthy of your abundance because of the things that you've done in your life. But that's not how this works. We need to realize that of all the people that Yahweh decides to use to preserve the land of Canaan, because it is Abraham's land, he uses Mitzrayim. He uses the limitations. He uses the things that actually shut down prosperity, right? Because Mitzrayim is two limitations. What are those two limitations? Fear and doubt. What is the difference between fear and doubt? Fear is a construct of the imagination that basically creates scenarios in your brain that you become emotionally reactive to as a result of past, there's that word, triggers. And those past triggers then are reacted to, and you make micro adjustments you make subconscious adjustments to avoid experiencing that fear before it ever comes to pass. And therefore you have dictated what path you actually want to go. Instead of imagining and making micro adjustments intentionally towards abundance, towards superiority and when I say superiority, I'm going to understand. I'm not talking about something racial. I'm not talking about classes. I'm talking about mastery. Okay. When you become the teacher of teachers, you will understand what I'm saying. When you start to realize that the only reason why there are things in operation in your life is because of the fact that you are here for a purpose, and then you are able to master those fears and doubts. Now, what is doubt? Doubt's a little bit different. Doubt is basically a creation of a false identity, or again, achre selim, or aselim achre, the false God, right? And so in principle, the reason why that I felt it necessary to bring up these cows that are standing on the edge of the Nile was because you need to understand those cows did not attract the other cows. Those other cows went over and they stood apart from. Well, let me talk about that for a minute. Has there been a time in your life where you've desired something? For example, maybe a vehicle, maybe a special thing, or perhaps maybe some other relevant desire, and your friends get it, your coworker gets it, your other people in your circle of influence get it, but they didn't actually come to you. Well, what's interesting is a lot of people don't realize this, but those cows that went and ate in the marsh were setting an example for the cows that were on the edge of the Nile. You see, they should have told them that didn't get attracted to you because there's something wrong. But we're going to go and we're going to process in our abundance right next to you. Because why? Because that's how close it came to you, right? Oh, what a powerful parasha this is. And this isn't what, the second, third verse of this parasha, Miketz. So I think it is important that we pay attention to that little tiny addition in Torah that people miss, that there were 3 sets of cows. Okay. Any questions, any thoughts before we take a brief break and then jump into the next question?
I still don't understand 3 sets of cows.
Okay. So let me go ahead and share it again with you, and I will help you understand it. Or do my best anyways. Okay. So jumping back into the Young's Little Translation, which is going to get us the closest we can to the Hebrew. And the deal is that I can't actually show you the Hebrew because you can't read it. But the premise is that when it says here, 7 other kine are coming up after them out of the river, of bad appearance and lean flesh, and they stand near the kine on the edge of the river. Okay. The edge of the river is different than where the cows that are fat are feeding. So there are other cows on the edge of the river, and those 7 lean cows go and join those other cows on the edge of the river. They don't go join the cows, the fat cows. Later, they eat the fat cows. But yes, there is a 3rd set of cows. Can you see that now, or do I need to keep?
I still can't see the 3rd set. You got the fat ones and the skinny ones. Where's the other ones?
Right here.
That just means the fat ones.
Yeah, ignore that word other. And how do you know that means the fat ones?
And you know it's not.
Because the fat ones are not on the bank of the Nile.
They just came out of there. They got to be on the bank.
Okay. Well, and this is what I'll say. That was the observation that I made when I was studying the parasha this morning, is that they did not go stand next to the fat cows. They stood next to cows on the edge of the Nile. It doesn't say the cows, right? So when we go into the Hebrew here, this will make more sense. Let me see if I can expand it a little bit. No, that's wrong. There we go. Okay. So going over to so looking at first, let's look at this verse 2, right? That they went and they were in, let's look here, the marsh grass. Okay. Reeds, marsh plants, rushes, right? Which is ahu. Okay. Now, that is not the bank of the Nile. Okay. Then we go and we look at this verse, and what it says is they stood on the lip, the shafat of the Nile. Okay. The lip as a body part, not the reeds. Okay. Now, one who does not understand the level of the nuances of a change in the information of Torah would have overlooked the fact that there was reeds, ahu, and shaphat, which it should have just said went with them by the reeds, but it doesn't. It says they stood on this they stood upon the lip of the Nile. That's what that says right there in the Hebrew, the lip of the Nile. Okay. And it also here is saying the cows that were upon the lip of the Nile. So we have cows that are what? We have cows in verse 2 that are in the Ahu. All right. Yeah, grazed in the Ahu. And then there are some that are on the bank of the Nile. Then after that, after they stand next to, and when you, in Hebrew thought, when you stand with someone, you are in agreement with them.
Oh, that's scary.
Right? So the lean cows come and agree with the cows that are on the edge of the Nile. And once they do that, then they consume, in verse 4, they consume the other 7. That brief pause where they stop and stand next to those cows that are on the lip of the Nile is what got my attention. Why did they pause there before they came and ate the other cows? Right? So that's what my discovery was this morning, and that's why I brought that up as I was looking over the parasha this morning, because I can tell you that I had never noticed it before, but it stood out today that there's actually 3 sets of cows. Satisfy your question, Alan?
Still not convinced.
Okay, that's fine.
Just because of the positioning of each set.
Okay.
One in the marsh, one on the side.
Right.
And one coming out of.
Right.
Then the marsh be on the side too? The marsh goes right to the side of the river.
And that's the part where you need to remember when the plague of blood occurs, the Egyptians dig beside the Nile where the fresh water is, right?
But they couldn't find it. If I remember right, they couldn't find any.
But where did they get that wisdom? They got that wisdom because the Nile itself, and like I said, I learned this in geology class. Let me see if I can find something about it, that agriculturally the Nile, give me a second and I'll pull up that information. Well, I'll do my best. I mean, this was 25 years ago in college, but
So while you're looking that up, so when I read this week, that was one of my questions. So you had your fat cows, you had your lean cows. When they were consumed, and my question that I wrote down for today was, so then there became a third herd of cows. Did anybody realize that? That was my question. And that's how I came up with the third type of cow. And
No.
but yeah, and I guess I'm trying to
I could see it.
see how we got 3 separate herds of cattle here.
okay. So what can you repeat that, please? I was trying to concentrate on this.
Okay.
Sorry.
Basically, when I was reading that this week, that was one of my questions. So you had your ugly cows and your lean cows and your fat cows. And then the cows that were consumed. So in my mind, now I've got a whole new breed of cow. So that just kept coming up with me all throughout the week. So I had wrote down a question to ask today. Was there something about this becoming a new cow? And that's where, when you started talking about the third cow, my mind already went like, oh, okay, I'm on the right track. But now as you're starting to explain it, I'm seeing it a little differently.
So I'm still working on this, but this is what I'm gonna say. You are right, Paula K. And I just want to acknowledge something when it comes to this. Your insights often lean in the direction of the prophetic. And let me clarify prophetic real quick, okay? Number one, I am not a dispensationalist, and I am not in agreement with anything per se that Arminius taught, but I'm also not in agreement with Calvin. So let me make that clear. I am not a Pentecostal, not a charismatic. So when I use the word prophetic, I mean it in the sense of what that word actually means in the Hebrew, which is basically something to do with how a person operates within the realm of mysticism. What is mysticism? Connection to God. That's all mysticism means, is how one connects to God and how deep that connection is and what that represents. And so, truth be told, and this is powerful, what you're onto here is what I'm trying to explain, but in a different way. You're onto identity. Identity is key here. And so when those cows consume those other cows, yes, absolutely, that has to do with identity. Okay. But there's more to the concept. There's more to the idea here. And that is, those cows came out of the Nile for a reason, and we need to understand that reason. I'm just going to throw out there something. Whether there was a third cow set or not, the cows that came out of the Nile were attracted out of the Nile. Okay? No matter what, however it works out, the cows coming out of the Nile were definitely called. By whom is very important. We're probably not going to touch on that today. It was very significant to me that it said they stood on the edge of the Nile, because I knew that word edge was probably going to be lip, which has to do with words, which has to do with how fear and doubt work in their grandest scheme. Because the truth is during the wilderness season, we are reaping what we've sown. Well, that means there's a sowing season. And during the sowing season, what happens is the serpent, dragon, accuser, slanderer, devil, whatever you want to assign that mechanism to, accuses you of your past now in order to get you to create a future that is similar to it, because the future you is superior to the current you, no matter what, whether it be good or evil. And the future you is wiser about how to navigate, whether it be for good or for evil. Because in what capacity you are able to be good, you are able to be evil. And one may precede or supersede the other, but truth be told is the future self has greater wisdom. And that greater wisdom is about fear and doubt and guilt and anxiety. Okay? Those are the mechanisms here. So when we're dealing with identity, that's the key. And so what's the beauty of this? Alan doesn't see it. It doesn't really matter, because something caused those cows to eat those other cows. I propose that it was what drew them out of the water, right? And so that part we can get along with. Now, my knowledge of the Nile is based upon the volcanism that I learned in college, which I'm not able to really, so far, I haven't really been able to find anything. I can tell you that there's a recent development, but that doesn't prove anything for biblical per se, that the Nile is poisonous because of the minerals that are in it. But again, we can't necessarily prove that that was true back then. What I do understand is how the agricultural systems worked with the Nile is the sand was a filtration system. And they used that filtration system. So what they had is they would dig these pools. This is ancient Egypt now. They would dig these pools next to the banks of the Nile, and the sand would filter the Nile. And as a result, they would then use those pools to irrigate their fields. So whatever was in the Nile needed to be filtered. That's my understanding of it. That's from cultural anthropology. That's it. Okay. People going and learning how to read the hieroglyphics and understanding what was said on the Egyptian walls or whatever. So we're actually a little bit over time to move to the next question. So let's take a brief break and then we'll jump into the next question. Maybe we'll happen upon the possibility that one's connected to the other. All right, so we are back, and we're going to jump into the next question, which is,
Here is my phone. Forgive me, I forgot.
No, you're good.
The next question is, what is the significance of Genesis 41 verses 33 through 38? Or 36, sorry. 33 through 36.
So before we jump into that very important piece, my question is, did anybody else catch this? Is it in your notes? Like anybody else who was studying this parasha, did you notice Genesis 33 through 36? Don't go read it right now and start to come up with something. If you already had it in your notes, bring it up. Otherwise, we'll talk about it right now. Okay. So, we'll go ahead and pull this up. (41, 33 through 36). Okay. So basically, it says, so now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise and appoint him over the land. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him take a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt as a tax in the 7 years of abundance. Then have them collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority and have them guard it. Let the food be used as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. Now, the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. Okay, so 33 through 36, not 37. I got ahead of myself there. Any thoughts first before I speak? I want to see if anybody else wants to make any statements. Okay, so I have a question within a question because this was a question to begin with. So, question within the question. Where did Joseph get this idea? That's my first question. Where did Joseph get this idea?
Well, at first glance, it kind of looks like a tithe offering.
Okay.
But it's only half of that. It's half of a tithe offering.
It's a fifth.
Only, right. It's only 5% versus the 10%. But
okay. So, first of all, my first question is, I'm sorry, my second question is this Joseph operating as a prophet? Or is this Joseph operating in his knowledge that he has accumulated over the years concerning business, or both, or something else? Anybody want to unmute, speak up on that?
I don't think he's operating as a prophet here. think he's operating with wisdom, with understanding.
Okay. So if that's the case, why does he advise Pharaoh to find someone else? Question number one, is he operating in his identity or outside of his identity? So there's one of two possibilities, and maybe we'll say a third. First possibility, he's operating in humility and he's well in his identity, but he understands that it could possibly be somebody else and not him.
Mm-hmm.
He knows the drill, but he has enough light to know, and he's in a state of contraction enough to know that it might not be him.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, he's self-defacing. He's actually afraid of that success or, not wanting to be the one, right? Because a lot of times when you don't want to be the one and the offer's right in front of you, you're the one. Yeah, you're the one. And most likely, if you get jealous of a one whom you actually are supposed to be in that state, it's because you're not walking in your fullest potential. But so those are the two possibilities. A third possibility is that he is intentionally doing this because he knows that he'll be selected.
Well, he is positioning himself as a wise person. But he knows that Pharaoh could also have other wise people in other positions that could fill that position as well.
So you lean more towards the humility.
I think I lean more towards the humility of it.
Okay.
But you also have to look at his position when he got brought to Pharaoh. He was being brought right out of prison to Pharaoh to interpret this dream. So he didn't look at himself as one of the counselors to Pharaoh.
Yeah.
So he was being very humble, very respectful
and
to his current position.
Yeah.
Okay. So then let's go ahead and align with that concept and let's see if maybe we can kind of discern how this goes. So now here is the deal. You are now the one in prison, and you now have been called before Pharaoh, and you are now expected to interpret a dream.
I have to tell you something.
Go ahead.
I got chills when I read about, I got big chills when I read about when he set up Joseph coming out of prison to be head of everything. I want you to know that because I think it connects very much so with him having the dreams in prison and the dreams.
Of course. Yes, absolutely. And we will address that in a minute for sure, Mom. I agree with you. Let's just get it into context. So here's the premise. Number one, he has to operate as an Elohim in context. What I mean by that is there are people who have books with lists of psychological symbols that represent dream elements. So you dream about a dog in a dream, it means something psychologically. Then there's people that are maybe a little bit more towards the quacky side who have basically come up with what they think, or perhaps are operating within their personal gift of what a dream means. But I'm going to share with you, both are in error, because if there's anything to be said about dream interpreters in the Bible, most of them say this: The interpretation is not of man, but of God. And when we look at that Hebrew word Elohim, we realize that that means you need to be operating in your identity and your higher and future self in the light. Now, where this becomes important is in the sense of how would have Joseph stepped into his position in front of Pharaoh. He knows, number one, this doesn't guarantee a ticket out of prison. It doesn't, right? Number two, it doesn't guarantee that he himself will be correct by just working through logic. He knows he has to tap into something greater. Sufficient enough that in verse 38, Pharaoh says, we can't find anybody else who is divine Ruach, who is a divine Ruach. That's what it says. It doesn't say has or possesses, but who is divine Ruach, right? Or Ruach Elohim. Okay, so contextually, then, we arrive at something interesting, and it's this. He does not go before Pharaoh thinking he's going to get out. He does not go before Pharaoh thinking he's going to be able to ask Pharaoh for something. He knows that no matter however much he might be innocent, and there's people who speculate on how innocent he really was, he knows that that's not the issue at hand. So I propose that however much Joseph knew the ropes of business organization and of supply and demand and of commodities and all the other stuff that he knew that prospered the warden of the prison, that prospered his father, that prospered Potiphar, he definitely was operating in the prophetic here. In other words, he was operating as an Elohim with his identity intact and was able to say what needed to be said that had nothing to do with him, but the best possible message he could communicate from the intensification of all power in the universe to Pharaoh, who was not operating in covenant. That is who and how Joseph was operating. Not, I'm going to get out of prison if I suggest this. He was not operating from the point of view of saying, I don't want to be in this position. He was not operating from the point of view of, I'm not worthy of this position. He wasn't self-effacing. He wasn't feigning humility to manipulate the situation. He was speaking with the mouth of Elohim exactly what needed to be done in order for it to occur. However much he may have had knowledge of business or whatever, he was operating in the prophetic. And the proof, just like Mom said, is actually the dream itself. Why? Because when Joseph dreamed of the stalks of wheat bowing down to his stalk of wheat, Pharaoh dreamed of stalks of wheat. No accident, no coincidence. When Joseph heard Pharaoh's dream, he would have made the connection and said, I need to operate in my purpose right now. Because whatever it is that's going to happen next is going to happen for me, not to me. And whatever is going to happen next, I need to make sure at this moment and in this process, I am operating within my identity. Because if I don't, the outcome will not be an Elohim. the outcome will not be divine. And he knew that. There's a few commentators who say that Joseph never learned the skills that he was mentioning right now. I tend to agree. He was a shepherd. He was not business savvy. He was a shepherd and he was good at it. And so we could get into all kinds of things about shepherding and about that from a business perspective, but macroeconomics was not his skill set. And that's exactly what was necessary. GDP, taxes, all that stuff was not part of Joseph's skill set. That's, I think, is Ibn Ezra, who's a very logical rabbi, by the way. He says Joseph couldn't have known these things. Pretty sure it was Ibn Ezra. Okay? Okay. So, any thoughts?
But his time that he spent in the prison and then became a so-called trustee, I'm sure in doing that and how well he was, from what the Bible says about him, he had to have learned some of that within those systems. And even the house that he belonged to prior to that, he was one of the, I guess, higher servants, so to speak. He had to have learned just by watching how those type of households had to be run. And it's the same business sense, whether you're running a house or whether you're running a corporation. It's the same logic, just on different levels.
Yeah, we discussed in weeks past how his father, Jacob, was in covenant with God. The covenant was that he, God said, I will do this, and do this. And Jacob responds, if you do these things, you will be my God, and I will give you 10% of all that I have. So as Jacob's son, he would have seen his father giving to God and seen the response of giving to a greater, right? Why would he not be able to apply that to a larger economic system?
And even as a shepherd, I mean, people call me a rancher, but they think I just have cows and horses and dogs. But I have to understand the cycles of nature, how much hay to put up in the barn, how much hay I need to have in the barn, how many tons of fertilizer have to go on those fields to produce the type of hay that I need in the barn. And you can equate all that knowledge to those economic systems, and it's the same thing that's happening here. So he might have not had the title or maybe even the degree, but he had the knowledge.
Okay. So this is the one thing I'm going to propose, and I'm just going to say it this way. We're actually both right. And that is actually what I wanted to eventually arrive at. And the reason why is because, first of all, just like the shepherding with his father prepared him for the stewardship in Potiphar's house, the stewardship in Potiphar's house prepared him for Pharaoh. And the nuances of that are not necessarily relevant, but what is. And this is going to come off of a set of principles that I live by, which is simply this. Number one, the only place that God is made strong, and what I mean by that is where he shines the most is in your weakness. The place where you shine the most is actually most likely going to then be what? Difficult to surrender control over to the higher self, right? I'm good at this. This doesn't really apply, right? But what's interesting is that we see from the garden, and I'm going to use a term that is not my own, co-authorship. Short version of this is, yes, him shepherding for his father and eventually becoming the overseer of his brothers prepared him for Potiphar. Him becoming the chief servant over the other servants prepared him for the prison. Him becoming chief over the prison prepared him for being chief over Egypt. But Egypt was a God-sized task. And all of his preparation could not have prepared him for the need to be so wise and discerning. Because this is what I want you to think about. He just spent 13 years with the scum of the earth, 13 years innocent amongst men who chose to do the things that he was accused of, 13 years amongst people who will kill you, who will exploit you, who will cause damage to your psyche, your body, your life. 13 years navigating, learning how to discern manipulators, discern liars, discern thieves. 13 years preparing him for the simple task of running Egypt. You look at me like I have two heads.
No.
It's not a simple task, is it? No, it is humongous. Paula K., you don't realize what you just said. You said, I am such a good rancher, I'd make a good president. That's what you said. But I propose to you that in order for you to be president, you will need something other than what you know right now. Mm-hmm. And that is the power behind this. I believe 100% that Joseph prophetically stated to Pharaoh what needed to happen, not what he knew. But I propose that he was prepared to take over Egypt by the things that had preceded it. In other words, he was not speaking of his own wisdom when he gave those instructions to Pharaoh, but he definitely was prepared by those things to step into that role.
I think you're absolutely right. I can see how he, even if I believe that he knew it, and I do think that he knew it, I don't think he knew that he knew it, right? I think he had most likely had seen his father do this all of his life, but he couldn't apply, he didn't know that it would apply to the situation, right? And then it takes a godlike spark to say, to bring it up, to like, oh, you know the answer, you know, even if you don't, even if you are thinking of it, or you don't make the connections or whatever. It's like a godlike aha moment, you know, type of thing where the connections are then made. So I think you're right. I think it is both, where he probably knew, had seen it somewhere in his past, understood it, but yet couldn't see how it would apply. So like PK had said, you know, there, you know, she has all these things that she knows and needs to know to be able to run her ranch successfully that could apply to business, but how do they apply to business? You know, how does it apply to running an entire country? And making those connections sometimes is difficult. And it would take a an Elohim to be able to bring those connections together.
Something greater than just our knowledge.
And if he's operating in his humility, he wouldn't be making those things.
I'm just going to put something out there, and this is important. If your current position is not co-authorship, you most likely are drawing to you the things that you desire, and they're stopping right at your face and never coming into you and your life. Your friends, your family, your coworkers, they are experiencing the things that you desire, because that's how close it's coming, because you are not in a state of that co-authorship. And again, that is not my term, okay? That's borrowed from someone else. And I could tell you that it describes what I believe, because truth be told is that any observation of God in operation is your invitation. In other words, that is your purpose at that moment. And oftentimes we will attract to us the ones in need. We will have our vessels. During Omer, I wrote how a master will discern his vessel through what his desire is. In other words, he will identify that he wants something in his life, and he'll agree that that is actually from the divine. Now, if that contains Torah violations, there's some sort of refinement that needs to occur. But the same is true. For example, with David, this is a perfect example. Those who are bent on determinism have a hard time with this question, and that is, if Bathsheba was in David's life, then it was the will of God. So was it okay that David killed Uriah the Hittite? Was it okay that he committed adultery? Was it okay that he covered it up? Well, according to determinists, according to Calvinists, according to predestinationists, yes. Their logic follows. So if we accept that he was supposed to be with Bathsheba to begin with, was it okay for him to violate Torah? No, absolutely not. Something would have happened. David was already demonstrated that God would kill a woman's husband in order for her to be with him. He'd already shown David the model, right? He'd already said, okay, you know what? Nabal is absolutely wicked. So we're just going to take him out of the equation so Abigail can become David's wife. But all that was to show him that he did not need to break the rules to get Bathsheba. He got Bathsheba because through Bathsheba was going to come Solomon. Short version of this, guys, is the desire that comes upon your heart is from the divine. So the premise is if that's the case, then we can conclude that somehow it plays a role in your purpose. And that the need to connect not only to Torah as a realistic limitation to prevent you from doing things like killing a woman's husband, right? In other words, that you don't harm another is a mechanism of, for lack of better words, co-authorship. Now, where this becomes powerful is in the sense and understanding that when you are not in that process, when you observe God at work, but it is not a mechanism of your life at that moment, and you observe him at work, and then you get into the context of watching from a distance, seeing God at work and not joining him in it at that moment, in its simplicity, short version of this is that we just end up watching it happen exactly that way from a distance. We watch that prosper in someone else. We watch the things we desire come right up to our face, but never meet. So that's important. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. I believe Joseph was operating in the prophetic up until the moment that he was appointed, and then all of his skills that made him the beautiful leader that he had become, and the divine from the prophetic that he was operating in at that moment, came together and made one powerful king. So that is the significance of Genesis 41, 33 through 36. I think this is actually a good place to take our lunch break, and we will probably be back in about 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll start the second installment of this broadcast. For those of you who can't stay, Shabbat Shalom.